And we are live. Kyle, how are you, sir?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Uh, Very well. I told you before that I thought this would be like a therapy session. And so you are the perfect person to join me on this because, well, I guess I should say how this idea kind of birthed in my head. But I made that video about the carnivore diet, and I couldn't really anticipate the response that I was going to get. But and we can talk all about the different subcategories of the carnivore diet. But basically, I had done like a zero carb meat and water diet, as you know, and as we've talked about in the past. But a lot of people were saying, you know, you did it wrong. You're supposed to do a raw version of that diet. You're supposed to do organs. You're supposed to do all these other things. And when people were saying this, I was like, I know a person that's actually done this, and his name is Kyle. And not only that, he's a scientist. He's very, very intelligent. You know what? My audio is very. How is the audio?
Yeah, how's mine?
Is it better now? Man, always an issue with this. Okay, I'll watch the chat, guys, but let us know. Now I'm in like the red on my things, but maybe it's better now. But anyways, keep us updated on the audio and who needs to be turned up and down. Okay, it's better now. Anyways, thank you, Kyle, so much. You know, you have a PhD. Do you want to give us just a little brief background of yourself?
Sure. I started experimenting with diets early in college. I went through the vegetarian, through vegan, through raw vegan pathway, the cellular mechanism. And that's what caused me, I became really obsessed with it, and I changed my major to biology and decided I wanted to do scientific research. And by the time I had actually gotten to graduate school, I had gone through like paleo, gotten into paleo, actually it was from the raw vegan thing through Agenus von der Planet's raw foodism, and then into more of a paleo type thing, like more meat and less fruit and dairy, and then raw meat, and that's, you know, the raw meat and the organs and all that diet. And then through grad school and then through meeting you and kind of like reading some Ray Peat stuff, I added carbs back into my diet, and that's where I'm at now.
Okay, so we should do some defining of terms. So to me, zero carb, I guess just for this conversation at least, means like Owsley Stanley. Do you know who that is? Like the guy that used to do ballet and drop acid for the Grateful Dead and stuff. So that's the bear. And to him, to me, he's kind of the godfather of at least meat and water diets, you know? And so that's what I attribute to zero carb. And of course, Charles Washington and Joe Anderson and his family, and now Sean Baker and many other people, they're talking about the zero carb diet. But like, to me, carnivore diet also means zero carb, but I understand that's different now. And so what I used to think about the carnivore diet is now seems to be what I used to think about the primal diet is now the carnivore diet, I guess. And so that doesn't make any sense.
Mark Sisson primal or Agenus von der Planet's primal?
I think Agenus von der Planet's, because people like Frank Tufano and Tristan from Primal Edge Health and a handful of people, they'll use carnivore as just like a high animal product diet. Mm. So I guess what you did was a carnivore / Agenus von der Planet's raw primal style diet. And the other thing is, I want to, as far as possible, try to let like zero carb or any kind of low carb people know we're not coming from a place of that we don't understand why somebody would do this. We're not trying to stop anybody from doing what they want to do either, you know. It's just it's interesting to me and part of my life and my experience, and I feel like not so much arguing for any specific diet, but just more perspective, like you mentioned in your paper. Not like the dueling paper approach is very limited, and kind of painting like a bigger picture of what is involved in health, getting into the hormones and stuff. So stop me if I'm wrong on any of this, but we are both former zero carb carnivore diet advocates, like vocal about it. Neither of us are vegan or vegetarian. Right. We're not trying to convert you to our diet religion. Neither of us, or correct me if I'm wrong, but neither of us are necessarily pro-vegetable. Like I see lots of issues with them, especially with people with digestive problems. And and again, I'm not trying to say you and I see things the same, but I think our cumulative view might be a few degrees away from carnivore or a high animal product diet. What do you think? Is that accurate?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I guess I agree with all that.
Okay, and so we define terms, have common ground, and then the only other thing, housekeeping wise, all super chats are donated to Ray Pete. You can block people in the chat if they're bugging you. Like, I'm not going to go out of my way to block a lot of people, and I rarely, if ever, do that. And that's it. So, okay, let me switch the screen here.
Are there going to be carnivore people watching this stream right now?
I mean, we'll find out.
Okay.
Cool. Okay,
so you said anything about my audio?
Eli, audio is all good.
Okay.
I think. Cool. Okay, so we got kind of the Cliff Notes version. Do you want to go into the long range version of your health adventure? Like, because it's pretty intricate, and I think it's necessary for people to understand like where you're coming from, and it's very similar to mine as well. But I mean, were there health problems that you were interested in correcting through diet?
No, that was my big mistake. It was one of those like engineering, if it's not broke, engineer it until it is, or whatever that saying is. I just became obsessed with the idea of a perfect diet in a kind of abstract sense. I didn't really have any health problems.
And
I caused myself health problems over that. Well, like small things, like when I was vegan and stuff, I couldn't gain weight, and I was at like an unhealthy low weight and things like that.
And you did things like wrestling and things. You were pretty active, right?
Yeah, I still do jiu-jitsu and stuff like that.
And then from our first conversation, which is like one of the most disliked things ever, apparently, on my YouTube channel.
Is it?
For some reason, I listened to it again. I didn't think it was that controversial, but you had met like a vegetarian group when you went to college. Was that right?
Oh, yeah. I was kind of not all I really cared about, because in high school I started lifting weights, and I just wanted to gain muscle, so I just ate food, like as much food as I could. I would look at packages for protein content. I was just always trying to get protein and not avoid the other macronutrients, but just get more protein. And I kind of avoided sugar because like it was sort of percolating in the ether a little bit. Like empty calories was what they used to call it back in the 90s, like soda and candy. So I kind of avoided that stuff, like desserts and sweets, but not like religiously or anything. And then when I met vegetarians, they started saying things like, oh, you're not supposed to eat meat, or you'll be healthy if you don't eat it, or like meat ferments in your intestines or something like that. And like stuff that's scary, and I didn't know anything. And it kind of made sense, I guess. And then from there, unfortunately, I get into things in an extreme way. So like all of those people are just eating a normal vegetarian diet, whereas I started consuming like vegan literature and switching over to that. And then like, I was a fruitarian for a while.
I didn't know that.
I even read a book. Have you ever heard of breatharianism?
I have. I don't know. I probably have like a caricature of it, but is there more to it than obviously just breathing?
No. The people, they all eat food, but their claim is that they're not eating the food for nutrition, but it just allows them to interact on the same vibrational plane as other people that are eating food. So they're not getting nutrition from the food. They're getting nutrition from breathing.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll have to try that.
They also claim that teeth evolved not to chew, but to talk.
Fair enough. I've never heard that before.
I think that has a kernel of truth. I think human teeth are kind of designed for speech a little bit, but lots of animals have teeth.
But that's interesting. I didn't actually know that. So you started changing your nutrition more for an ethical or philosophical view rather than health problems.
Yeah, at first it was just regular kind of vegetarian, like the stuff that's really reasonable. Like all those videos of behind the scenes of factory farms, they do look pretty awful sometimes.
Yeah.
And I think pretty much anybody would prefer that their food not be raised that way. And then you feel like a responsibility. And then I got into the health side of it, and just like, it kind of fell into one of these like orthorexic kind of need to find the perfect diet things.
And then give us a date. So me and you met 2010, but when are you experimenting vegetarian, vegan stuff?
Well, I think we met in 2011.
You're right.
The August.
Yeah.
That would have been 2003. Would have been when I first started trying vegetarian stuff, and 2004 vegan, and maybe so at some point in 2004 switching to a raw food diet, and definitely by 2005 I was trying different raw vegan diets, like a fruitarian or like a high fat raw vegan diet with nuts and seeds and avocados. And then maybe 2006 or maybe late 2005, this I'm not sure about, but started adding animal foods like unpasteurized cheese. That was like the gateway into the Agenus Vonderplanitz thing. And then I lived in southern New Jersey, close to the Pennsylvania border, and Philadelphia. And Pennsylvania and California, this might have changed, but at the time they were the only two states that you could retail sell unpasteurized dairy. So I was able to go into Philadelphia and get from like the Amish or Mennonites or whatever, raw milk and all kinds of raw dairy products. And so I switched over to that. And then maybe 2008, I think that's when somebody started the Raw Paleo Forum.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for mentioning
I was added to that really early,
mm-hmm.
and became really active on there. And at that point, maybe somewhere around 2007 to 2008, I started cutting out a lot of the dairy and just focusing on meat, and then switching to eating raw meat. And then around 2008, I'd switched probably completely to eating, like 80% or more of my diet was raw meat and organs. And that lasted basically until I met you, more or less.
Back up a little bit. What was the transitioning point of the vegetarian or vegan to Agenus? Like, if there wasn't necessarily a health or it was maybe at that point there was a health component. Like, what made you switch between the two?
Actually, I think it was my cat.
Pottinger's cat studies.
Yeah, I got a cat in 2005. And, I was obsessed with nutrition. So I was like, well, I got to feed the cat like the perfect cat diet, the way I'm eating the perfect human diet. And that basically immediately broke the ethical thing about meat, because I just went, oh, well, like cats obviously eat meat.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even a question. So it just completely changed my perspective. And I was like, well, I guess it's okay to feed my cat meat. And then once I started hearing about, because what happens is you get into a thing like vegetarian, and then you start hearing from vegans, like either in real life in person or like online. And then when you hang out with vegans or in the reading about veganism, you'll hear from raw food vegans. So that's like the pipeline. And I started on some of these raw vegan websites, there'd be somebody that was like an apostate and had added raw cheese or whatever kind of animal food, usually egg yolks. That was like popular, raw egg yolks. And yeah, so once my moral or ethical thing for the vegetarianism broke from feeding my cat meat, I was like, it just became a nutritional thing, and these people were making arguments that made sense to me. So I just started adding animal foods in, and that was the transition.
And thank you for mentioning the Raw Paleo Forum. I almost like completely forgot about that. But that, like the Charles Washington and the Zero-Carb, they had their own forum. But then I knew there was I don't think it was competing, but that Raw Paleo Forum. But I felt like it was more hippie, like the Raw Paleo Forum. And like the Zero-Carb was more straightforward. And so I think that's because of my very rigid personality. I needed like straight guidance for what to do or whatever. But Yeah, I don't know. Is there anything interesting in between there? I remember you saying during medical school or during your like biology classes, you would bring in like rotting meat and things. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it wasn't rotting, but it was raw. And for a while, I ate like raw chicken. I remember going to like biology class or whatever, and having a break in between classes, and having one of those glass lock containers, with the plastic lids. Back when they first came out, and that was like an amazing thing because, of course, the plastic is gonna like you can't have food in plastic. You might as well. So, and like sitting around campus somewhere and taking out from my backpack like a warm thing with like two like raw chicken breasts that I cut up with like kitchen scissors, and like a thing of chopsticks and just like eating it. I can't believe I didn't get sick from that. I never did though. But it was mostly beef, and yeah, people. It got to the point like at first it's nice to have the attention, and then after a while I just hated it. I would like hide. I would take out like this glass lock container with like raw meat that I cut up or anything, and like hide, eat it like secret. And then somebody inevitably would go, "Is that raw meat?" And then everybody, like if it was at work or at a school thing, they'd be like, "Oh my God, what are you doing?" And I would have to explain it again and again. And then they would be like, "Oh, that's so interesting," and I just like got real tired of that.
I align with that so hard. Like when I was on tour, other band members would like seek me out when they heard that I ate like an all meat diet, and they just wanted to like see me like a circus attraction. And at first it was kind of fun, but I had similar experiences to you. I remember eating pemmican and it causing like a stir in the break room, and then my manager asking me to like go outside. Eat it like so it was
it didn't smell, did it?
Yeah, so it was odd. Okay, so you go into the like deepest end of the pool. Was that was majorly inspired by Ogenus? Did you get his books and things like that?
Oh yeah, the recipe book.
Mm-hmm.
I actually tried a lot of those recipes, and one of the worst things I ever had the worst foods I ever had were during that time period. One was a smoothie that he has a recipe for that's like raw liver and milk and honey, and it makes this purple smoothie that just tastes like raw liver in liquid form. It's really bad. And the other worst thing I ever had was raw kidneys.
Somebody asked Ray, they're like, "Should we eat kidneys?" And he's like, "I never smelled one that I wanted to eat."
Yeah. Yeah, if you don't like soak them in milk and cook them, they just have this acrid, like it's pretty obvious that they're filtering things.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So you're doing that, and then when do you meet Lex on the Raw Paleo Forum?
Yeah. So he was like a heavy hitter right away. It was one of those things like I'm still to this day, I'm a global moderator on that forum.
Oh, I didn't even know it was still up.
Yeah, I haven't been there. I think I checked it, like I'll check it once a year, just I'll think of it and log in. And I think I got an email a couple months ago because if somebody does something, the moderators get an email. Yeah, I became really active on there, and that was kind of my lifeboat. So I had been on David Wolf's the rawfood.com forum, and that's like I spent all my time from like 2004 to 2008 on there, and that's where I got introduced to raw animal foods. And then somebody that knew me from there invited me to this other forum, and I joined, and I just completely flipped over and stopped using the previous forum, and just became super active on there. And right away, Lex Rooker, he started this super long thread with just copious amounts of personal data.
His journal, right?
Yeah, his journal.
So I want to get into the details of this. So for anybody that doesn't know, Lex Rooker predates, I mean, I think I might be making this up, but hasn't he been doing it for like at least 20 years or something?
I don't know when he started, but he used to do all kinds of, like, I think he tried a vegetarian or vegan experiment when he was younger, and he tried fasting.
Yeah. He was like a Pritikin disciple, like,
right.
Yeah. And he is the most meticulous person I've ever met, and he builds clocks And so if you
Yeah.
YouTube building clocks, like it is, I can't even, he like when I heard that he does that, I was like, yeah, Lex is probably the only person I've ever met that can do something like that because it's so difficult. But he is extremely intelligent. Like, but yeah, I remember going to his thread and him just having a way with words and being like an obvious source of knowledge for the carnivore diet or the zero carb, but he was of course doing raw.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember being on the zeroing in on health forum with Charles Washington and Lex like coming over to it. And this could have been in my imagination, but I swear there was like some kind of adversarial thing going on. Like, I don't think Charles liked people coming into the forum that challenged his authority about the diet. But I think Lex like just randomly hit me up, and then we lived pretty close to each other and became friends. And he's a ridiculously interesting guy. And then the first time we met each other was at Ancestral Health Symposium in 2011. But then didn't we also go to Lex's house and make pemmican at one point?
No, I went to his house and I saw where he does it, and I saw where he has people over to do it, but I wasn't part of one of those trips.
Okay, so you're doing the carnivore thing, and then the Ancestral Health Symposium. And I remember, didn't Lex bring Lex brought cookies, and he brought like pemmican or something. But I remember meeting you and being like, Kyle is deep into the carnivore stuff. And obviously I knew you were very intelligent because I'd seen your posts on the Raw Paleo Forum. But I think I was shocked when a few years later, I got wind that you were speaking from a different point of view at the Ancestral Health Symposium with your first lecture.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, it was at the 2013 one that
I think so.
is lost.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a real shame. Actually, like 3 or 4 months ago or something like that, a bunch of those were recovered and put on their YouTube channel, and mine wasn't one of them. So I got this like false hope for a second but no,
that was like fat in the hypothalamus of the rat for obesity or something.
Yeah, it was basically my dissertation proposal in a popular talk form for what I was doing at grad school at the time, and it fit really well with like the whole hypothalamic inflammation thing was popular. Sort like I don't know. It's one of those things where everybody's like, "Oh, okay, we found the mechanism for obesity. We got it."
Well, give us a brief idea of the experiment. I kind of forgot what the details were. Didn't you create like lesions on the hypothalamus or something?
No. Mine was purely nutritional.
Okay.
But that's how the neurons, the neuron populations that like control hunger and body temperature and metabolism and stuff were first discovered, is by lesioning this one instead of this one, and the mice would either not eat and get really skinny, or they would get fat or whatever. But my experiment the idea was that PUFA would create either oxidative byproducts or prostaglandins in these neurons and cause inflammation, and versus like a high saturated fat diet. Because the idea is that it's like a low grade inflammation. It's not like sepsis, acute inflammation that would cause a fever or anything. And it is true that the inflammatory molecules, they block things like insulin receptor and leptin receptor. So the hypothesis made sense, but nobody's really been able to demonstrate that any nutritional regimen really works super well, especially at the human level, to cause like measurable inflammation like that would cause weight gain. But that was the idea.
And that wasn't very very combative in the Ancestral Health Symposium, right? You didn't get flack for that presentation. That fits into.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
That was like very accepted.
Okay. And then what was it? When did you publish this? The dangers of fat metabolism and PUFA.
2016. That was
okay.
out.
So 2 years. Did you say 2013? So 3 years later.
Yeah.
Okay. So what happens between the 3 years? You're just getting more deep into the metabolic angle.
Yeah, I just got more into the Ray Peat thing, and I It was mostly, so when you're doing a dissertation, a big part of it is the literature review in the beginning. And I just kept finding things like, because at first I was like, okay, so saturated fat is good. Because that's like one of the ways that I was able to sort of transition into some of Ray's ideas was that he agrees with paleo or carnivore people about saturated fat versus, unsaturated fats, cholesterol. Um, some carnivore people think salt is okay. That's like a, so there's things like that. And so at first I was like, okay, so the whole problem is PUFA. And I found all these papers about like the huge increase in PUFA intake over the 20th century that matches the obesity epidemic pretty well and stuff like that. And then I started finding these papers where high carb diets in the absence of fat, and I put this challenge out every time I give a talk for somebody to find a paper where either an animal or a human is given a high carb diet with low fat and it causes them to get fat because those don't exist. The only time, and what's really interesting is you find all these, because I was tuned in to looking at the methods and scrutinizing them, because I found that a lot of people writing about high fat diets would say it's a high saturated fat diet, but the saturated fat content was less than the PUFA content, let alone the entire unsaturated content. So it's like very misleading to say, this is high in saturated fat. They're just, or they would not even report the fatty acid content and then say, oh, this saturated fat in this diet caused this outcome in our study. It's like, how, so I was really tuned into that. And that was kind of my thing in grad school, like with my dissertation, was having a big critique of the way people would report the diets they used in these experiments or not report them, make misleading statements about, like, saying a nutrient that they didn't isolate caused something when you can't say that when it's not isolated. And then I started finding slowly the same thing with sugar, where they would say this is a high sugar diet, but it was also high in fat. So it'd be like, maybe 20% or less protein, maybe like 15 or something. And then it would be 50-50 for the rest of the calories would be carbs and fat. And most of those carbs would be sugar. And so for a mouse, 40% of their calories from fat is a lot.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's I think a high fat diet is 45% of calories, and 40 is like moderate to high. So, and I could not find a study that kept fat calories low, unless you like do something like surgically lesion the animal or a really powerful genetic deletion or modification that cause animals to get fat, or humans with a low fat, high carb diet, even if it's like fortified with tons of sugar.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember you talking about like having to like special order chow or something. Wasn't it pretty difficult to find the correct food for your experiments?
Yeah, I designed the diets with the Research Diets company, the one, it's like the biggest supplier, and they got kind of some notoriety when Chris Masterjohn wrote something about, because they had been measuring the types of fats in the ingredients that they get, and they found that the lard they were using was had twice as much PUFA as they had been labeling, and they put out something about that, and he picked up on that and wrote about it and said, there's, and that's another whole problem, is even beyond the scientists that were using their products, and then pretty much every other company copies Research Diet's main two products, their kind of control diet and the high fat diet. So everybody that was using those, not only were these people doing kind of a bad job reporting what was in the diets and making connections that didn't make sense and being a little misleading, but they themselves were getting artificially low PUFA and artificially high saturated, and I think oleic monounsaturated percentages for the diets, if they even reported them correctly. So it was this like field wide, of course nobody in the field like acknowledged it or cared about it, but it was like a thing where all of these papers saying, oh, saturated fat caused this, are now whatever the percentage that they said the diet was, it was lower, much higher on saturated fat.
So you're noticing all these incongruencies, and also your own experiment that you had performed with the PUFA. So those, as you had mentioned before, kind of shift you in a direction, ultimately writing this paper.
Yeah. It was mostly that what clicked for me was it seemed like we're living through a repeat of the moment when stuff like Pritikin and others had planted the seeds, which, because there wasn't social media, the internet back then, they grew a lot more slowly. But the idea that saturated fat and cholesterol cause heart disease, and eventually that they cause kind of everything bad, like obesity and whatever, that we were living through a similar moment with sugar, and that the scientists and the commentary and everything was making the same fundamental, maybe not exactly the same because it's different, but the same genre of mistakes to get there. And so I was like, well, okay, I'm going to go to these things, and I knew that nobody was going to like it, and I knew that like not one person on a paleo diet or a low or zero carb diet was going to change their diet because I said this, but I just almost wanted, like, for the historical record, like, let the record show that there was a guy in 2016 and 2017 at these paleo, and it ostensibly it's like Ancestral Health Symposium, but those, like, the paleo has been pretty monopolized by the low carb faction.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So and so I just wanted there to be a record of somebody saying, like, this anti-sugar, anti-carb in general, but specifically anti-sugar, anti-fructose thing doesn't have a good foundation, and it seems like at some point it's going to have to go through the process of becoming a fad, becoming mainstream, becoming dogma, and then it'll start to revise itself and fall back, and by that'll be like 20 years from now or something. But yeah, I just wanted to shout that into the crowd.
That's interesting. It was mainly in defense of sugar, and that's similar to me, but in a different way. Like, I remember, and I don't think this is the best example, but I remember Matt Stone pointing out, like, the durian rider or whatever, and it's like, this guy eats the most sugar, but he's lean. And again, he might have he might be a sociopath, and so that might be a problem of his, or he might be crazy, but he's not fat. And that I like wrestled with that in my mind for a really long time, because Mark Sisson, not that I thought Mark was like a genius or anything, but his 150 grams insidious weight gain kind of thing, like, it just, what they were saying didn't seem to match up. And then also going to those conferences, I was like, a lot of these people are overweight. And again, I'm not saying that is proof XYZ, but I was like, something seems a little bit like wrong. And so I think those little things were chipping away at my like weak foundation, because it was mostly just dogmatic. Like, I wanted to talk about it, but like from where I was coming from, and from where a lot of the people I think on the internet are coming from, they'll always come from a speculative what our ancestors ate. And I don't know about you, but I actually think that's like a terrible place to start the investigation of adequate nutrition, And so that's why I appreciate your paper so much, because it goes through so many different layers of physiology, and I think that's like a good way to approach the situation, and I'm sure it could suggest many different foods, and foods also are dependent on where you are. Like when I'm in Mexico or America or Japan, my diet's going to be different depending on where I am, because everything's the availability of everything is different. But in your paper, like the second thing you say is these points underpin to the faulty approach of using clinical studies to answer the questions of whether low carb is good or bad. This reduces the debate to a back and forth of dueling studies rather than argue a side with a macro level data. I will present a discussion of the physiology of the metabolic state achieved from a low carb diet. Discussion in 3 parts: the acquisition of the fat burning metabolism, the long-term physiology associated with the state, and health implications specific for the polyunsaturated fatty acids. So if you'll entertain me, I'd just like to kind of go through those things, because I think they're important. But did I skip over anything?
No, I guess that it's funny to listen to listen to you read that. Because I don't read papers that I write. So it's like I literally just do the last edit, and that's the last time I ever hear it. So
well, I'm going to be reading this a lot to you. So
okay, great.
Okay, but anyways, I think this is good to nail down because at least in my video, and that was a huge motivator for getting you on here, but people were saying, and I can empathize, they're saying, hey, vegans have all these papers. They're always quoting studies and stuff, and they are so fundamentally wrong. Therefore, with this carnivore stuff, I have an ability to sit in the unknown and kind of let it play out. So I don't necessarily need, I'm being like a hypothetical carnivore person. Like I don't necessarily need all the studies to back my way of eating because I know how wrong it can be with the vegans vegetarian group. But if I were to say anything, I don't think the physiology is the same as some large study that a vegan would use to try to justify their diet. But you're much more familiar with those types of things than I am.
Yeah, well, the approach that I used and that I continue to use is like what I think is the scientific approach, which is the falsifiability, or to try to falsify. So when people make claims, like I don't think that the literature it's just like so messy, and I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with things like Retraction Watch. Is that it? Retraction Watch or Retract Watch?
I don't know about it.
Yeah, it's a website where scientific papers, mostly biomedical, it just charts. It posts when there's retractions, and there's retractions all the time. And for things, everything from like fundamental mistakes that invalidate the results to fraud.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I think what you can do is if somebody has a specific claim, like X causes Y, and the mechanism is Z, if you can find either why they're claiming that and just show that what the reference that they're using doesn't demonstrate that, or just something that's like physically impossible, then that's what I feel like is the strongest, the most powerful use of what we have in the scientific literature, to just say like, okay, that like sugar might be bad, like with a big B, in a way that like I can't understand, or that is unclear at this moment. But if you're saying like, oh, it's bad because it causes insulin resistance, see, now that is something that we can dig into and try to falsify. And I feel like I have done that, and then nobody has had any kind of cogent response other than just, I lost weight cutting out sugar, or I have a patient that was a type 2 diabetic and they cut out sugar and the symptoms went away.
I might be rating you this prematurely, but Ray has a great thing from his Glucose and Sucrose for Diabetes article in 2009. And he says, as information about the many physiological and biochemical events associated with diabetes has accumulated, the basic doctrine that sugar causes diabetes has extended itself to whatever the topic of discussion is. Glucose causes the death of beta cells. Glucose causes blood vessels to become leaky. Glucose causes cells to be unable to absorb glucose. Glucose causes the formation of free radicals. Glucose impairs immunity and wound healing, but causes inflammation while preventing the respiratory burst in which free radicals are produced by cells that cause inflammation. It disturbs enzyme functions. It impairs nerve conduction and muscle strength. And it is also addictive, causing people to irrationally seek the very material that is poisoning them.
Yeah, that's funny. The one about, some of those are funny.
Well, I thought of you when I actually read that, because some of those things were very similar to what we're going to get into. But I mean, do you want to go over the fat burning state? Because for me, this was... it didn't make sense, but it was like an interesting idea. When I first heard Ray talk about the fat burning state is actually synonymous with like sickness. And so like people with sepsis, or when you get extremely ill, that is a switch, like a switch from the metabolism to burning fat. And so And just the idea of stress initiating that state was plausible to me, you know. And so you like brilliantly summarize it here. Do you want me to read it, or do you want to go into it?
Yeah, just read it. I'm sure it's better that
Okay.
way.
You say the biochemical processes that mobilize stored. By the way, he can't see what I'm reading, guys. The biochemical process that mobilize, store, and dietary fat for use as energy substrate are initiated due to a depletion of blood glucose. The key hormonal switches involved, adrenal glucocorticoids and catecholamines, are secreted as a hypoglycemic response. And so we could probably just stop there because, actually, let's keep going. These hormones are also secreted in response to fasting. Unlike the reciprocity seen in the control of glucose usage by insulin, which is secreted as a reaction to glucose, the hormones that control fatty acid utilization are regulated by glucose, not fatty acid. So I think that's one of your major points, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So, and you called glucose a proxy for energy metabolism. I do want to I think we kind of just went through it, but that is like a major point of contention of people saying, you know, like dropping out the carbohydrates isn't necessarily stressful. You know, like I don't have to necessarily increase lipolysis when I go on a carnivore diet. And in our last conversation, you analogized it really well to like, what'd you say, the trash, thinking the trash will be picked up without the trash men or something.
No, that the trash men produce the trash.
Oh, yeah.
The presence of the trash men produces the trash, which it kind of does in a roundabout way, but nobody would ever describe that. Like there's a kind of human logic to, okay, yeah, but if trash stopped being put out on the corner, then trash men would go away. But if trash men went away, the trash on the corner wouldn't go. Like if there's a certain causality that like people logically understand, because in a kind of sense, the trash men do bring the trash in the sense that everybody knows, like, oh, I'm supposed to put the trash out here. The trash men come and take it, and that's why I'm putting it there. But they're not making the trash, you know, they're taking it away. And actually, that logic, that's the same kind of thing that people used to say about cholesterol and heart disease, and how, you know, cholesterol is getting deposited in these plaques, and it's not causing the plaques. You know, it's just a part of that whole process. So to me, it's the same logic that there's a nutrient that people have kind of like targeted for attack, and it's an important nutrient, and it's around, and it's something that people that are unhealthy have. And so the targeting allows people to just say whatever about it because it's present everywhere. So you could just say it's causing, you know, like, oh, prove me wrong. Like, oh, it's causing this, prove me wrong. And they don't have to, you know. So that was what I set out to do.
Something you had made sure to touch base on is the idea that it's not like one or the other. It's not like you're either burning sugar or you're burning fat.
Oh yeah.
And that like a healthy metabolism does both, you know? And so I know that's a common question. Maybe we could nip it in the butt like before it even comes about.
Yeah, I think the simplest way to make the distinction is an amount of fat burning and an amount of hypoglycemia that would stimulate hormone-sensitive lipase. Because there's always, like, you know, fatty acids getting put into adipocytes and getting taken out and getting put into different cells and used and burned and made into other cellular components. And some tissues, you know, preferentially burn fatty acids at rest all the time. But there is that hormone-sensitive lipase switch, and I think that's pretty much what people mean. But yeah, most people don't know that, and they just think, you know, maybe if you're eating sugar, you're not burning any fat at all, and then you're just storing fat. And whereas if you're not eating any carbs, you're burning entirely fat, which is also not true.
Just to beat a dead horse, but you're saying from your reading, like increasing the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal systems because you are artificially restricting carbohydrate. Is it good to be chronically running on these systems in your estimation?
Doesn't seem that way.
Well, what
Um,
would be some of the detrimental effects? Like you mentioned, even at a subclinical level, you're going to be producing more ammonia, correct, because of the gluconeogenesis, et cetera.
yeah, I mean, that's a real long-term
Mm-hmm.
kind of problem.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, although for some people, like one of the last AHSs I went to, Chris Masterjohn gave a talk about dangers of protein, and there's a couple of genetic disorders where if like people, just they didn't even know they had it, and then they ate like a really high protein, low carb meal and just died from that meal because their urea, they were like missing one of the enzymes to make urea, so their ammonia just went up so high that they, went into a coma. Um, but yeah, for normal people, it's just there's no benefit to have basically there's no benefit to having ammonia in the system that's not being made into urea. So, and the urea production system is saturable, at a point beyond which you can't. I mean, maybe there's some drug you could take or whatever, but in the like normal natural situation, you can only make so much urea, and it doesn't really get upregulated that much if you eat a ton of protein and oxidize that protein and release the ammonia. So that could be a problem. I don't really think it's that big of a deal though.
Oh, okay, so I skipped a little bit ahead, but the gluconeogenesis, this is a huge point of contention, I guess. And so one of the big proponents says like this is what do they say, demand driven rather than supply driven. And so again,
Mm.
I think they're talking about this outside the context of the metabolic rate and outside the context of stress or metabolic or counter-regulatory hormones, and et cetera, and things. So do you think that's why they're viewing it differently? As a like some rampant increase in gluconeogenesis is a negative thing.
Yeah, I think that so it's demand side when you are eating a normal diet. So if you have like you eat a normal amount of carbohydrate and then you do really intense exercise, like anaerobic exercise, like you'll turn on gluconeogenesis because you'll use up your blood glucose and the glucose in your muscles pretty fast. But when you're on a low carb diet, that also will I guess be ramped up to some extent if you exercise and use the very small amount of glucose that you have in reserve. But it's supply driven in that situation. There's only so much protein that can be used for protein synthesis at any given time. So if you eat more than that, no matter what's happening, it's going to be used to make glucose or glucose equivalents.
And you had reminded me in on Lex's journal, he had performed some experiment to figure out the amount of gluconeogenesis he was doing. I had completely forgotten, but do you recall like kind of the details of his experiment?
Yeah, he was because he went to the doctor on a very regular basis. I don't know how often,
I
but
wish
like,
I had his labs. They were like they were very interesting.
and he was trying to get his fasting blood glucose down.
Because it was like
Uh,
hovering at like 120 or something, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
and he thought he could do that by he was slowly because he used a scale and everything, and he would mix like different percentages of lean and meats to get an exact number or as close as you can without an isolated synthetic diet, an exact amount of carbs and well no carbs but grams of protein and fat per day, and he couldn't get it lower. And I think actually it went up at one point when he lowered protein. Uh, like it would just kind of bounce up and down. It didn't really seem to. It wasn't a linear thing where less protein caused less fasting glucose. But one thing that while he was doing that, he was doing literature review, and he found that it seems like half, even in somebody who eats a normal diet, half of the amino acids in most situations go to gluconeogenesis.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it would be more in a low carb diet.
I mean, I just want to throw this out there, but Lex actually, to my knowledge, at the time, mostly ate pet food, and so he was like mixing in all types of organs and things, and he ate lots of ground beef. And I was like there when he would occasionally mix his food, and he had a extremely expensive scale and would like put out the fat and mix them together and things like that. And but yeah, I don't know anybody ever that is more calculated than him. And so yeah, again, his thread on the Raw Paleo Forum was just like a wealth of knowledge about somebody being pretty open-minded and doing all this stuff. And also he looked pretty good, you know. I don't know, like I always thought he looked strong, you know, very intelligent guy, you know. So again, I will probably get there, but I don't think you and I are saying that going to this style of eating or whatever, especially from coming from another place like veganism or vegetarianism or the standard American diet, couldn't have some kind of health benefit. We're just kind of critiquing the idea from a metabolic or point of view or whatever. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
One
So
more thing about Lex, back when you were talking about the forum and stuff, I think the reason why you know, he had all that information, but the way that he wrote, like he was honest, and you could kind of tell.
yeah.
And when he said that he knew something or this was his experience, you could tell that he had done it. And I started noticing after years on these forums that people lie about, you know, like it's, you know, it's come out that like a lot of famous online vegans are caught eating meat or some kind of animal food. But regular people on these forums, like I was naive, and I still am. Like I generally believe what people say online, but the idea, like, what? Somebody's going to go on a forum and say that they don't eat meat and they haven't for 10 years and they're lying? Like, and what they really mean is like, I aspire not to eat meat, but I cheat on my like vegetarian diet twice a week or something. And you could just tell that there was none of that with Lex, and that he didn't overstate what he, like, people just rampantly overstate their level of knowledge about like nutrition or science on forums. So that was what was so great about him. And there's not really, I don't think there's any other Lex Rookers out there.
Thank you for saying that. I totally agree. I think I think if anything, I wanted to be the proponent of like these anecdotal claims about how amazing Zero-Carb was, and Lex, who had been doing it for a lot longer than I have, albeit he was doing a slightly different version. Like, I think he would try to like calm me down because I was so excited about it and writing about how it was like this miracle cure, you know? So, yeah, man, it was coming from a place of like true wisdom, I thought. And he had that over most people because just of his age, you know, he's older than most people that try that stuff. But also, like, you and I had both experienced it. You changed your nutrition and you experienced such like a boost, and then you want to shout it from the rooftops, you know? And I guess like part of my motivation here is like, if anybody were skeptical, it's like the ex-vegans becoming carnivores. We were talking, I think last time, about like them being kind of the same side of the coin, you know? It's like, don't make the same mistake that you just burst out of, you know, because I don't think the carnivore, not that I'm doubting anybody's improvements in health or how they feel or whatever, but I think it's just is equally fraught with error as a vegan approach, maybe a little bit better. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, like, you could pretty easily psychologize those people where they're going like from a diet that's like, okay, this one thing, meat, is the only problem, and if you don't eat meat, you'll be like perfectly healthy, and then switching to I'm only eating that one thing. That there's obviously some kind of extreme drive that is behind that, you know, like there's not a whole lot of things in life where like you seamlessly transition from like 0 to 100 like that, without some kind of like, and with the thing being a logical switch and not like a psychological switch.
The one thing I do want to emphasize is like, I think the extremeness, at least for me, was motivated by how shitty I felt, you know? And I was like, okay, well, you feel shitty at 50 carbs, like go down to 20, you know? And if you still feel shitty at 20, go down to none, you know? And so, and again, we're talking about like paradigms or frameworks or whatever. In the carnivore paradigm, there's not that much to do. You just decrease your carbs. You eat meat and water, and if like that doesn't work, you eat raw, or you start fermenting liver and for weeks or whatever. Like it's not that intricate, you know. So again, we're talking about it right now, but that's why I appreciate what Ray and Albert St. Georgi and Hans Selye and Otto Warburg and their cumulative insights on physiology, because I thought it was more explanatory of health problems, and it gives you more options, like we talked about in the podcast, like and we'll get there. Actually, I wanted to talk about it next, but moving to a place of high altitude or something might be a powerful therapy rather than tinkering with your diet indefinitely or something like that. But that's one of the long-term physiology associated with fat burning, would be a reduction in carbon dioxide, and moving to a place of high altitude would be a way to mitigate that without touching your diet, you know? So do you want to talk about a little bit about carbon dioxide?
Yeah. Oh, funny story. In the 2016 AHS, there was a guy that gave a talk about high altitude populations and how they're notoriously healthier in America and internationally. And he gave this whole thing, and he was coming at it from the perspective of hormesis. And he was saying that the lower oxygen is a stressor that is, hormetically making the organism stronger. And he has a website, I think it's called gettingstronger.com, and his name's Todd Becker.
Okay, never heard of him.
I think, yeah, he's like mid-level online, like has a little bit of notoriety in the paleosphere. At least, last I checked. And I talked to him after his talk, and I was like, have you ever considered that it's not the lack of oxygen, but the presence of CO2 that's causing any of these benefits? And he hadn't, like, at all. And he's like, he's at this AHS conference, so he's not, because if you had said that to a mainstream scientist, like, hey, have you ever considered that there's a totally different explanation for this finding that you, like, they would just completely, like, that conversation's over. So he wasn't that way, and he talked to me about it, but you could tell that he was like, no, but I'm the hormesis guy. Like, it's horme, like, that's how things get better, is like small stresses that make the organism better. But it was just funny because he had this whole elaborate talk, and you could give the exact same talk and just say, and that's why, CO2 is good. Just like replace low oxygen with increased CO2 in every one of his slides, and just have the same physiological result or like medical symptomatic improvement in people's, like, I think Colorado, it has the most high altitude percentage population. And they were like, when I was in grad school, they had this map. It's like a heat map with obesity. And every 5 years, like the state, like one of the states that was like at, 10% or 15% obese goes up to 20. And then the ones that were at 20 would go up to like 25 or 30%. And Colorado was like hanging tough for a really long, it was always, there'd be like a red and it would be like orange in the middle, or there'd be orange and there'd be yellow in the middle. And there was just like, oh, it's because they do rock climbing, outdoor activities. And it's like, it maybe, but is there any kind of real hard evidence that like Colorado is the most athletic state? I don't think so. I mean, is rock climbing, like, are mountain related activities do they make you more glucose tolerant than non-mountain related, like, sporting activities? It's just like a wacky thing. But nobody would ever be like, oh yeah, it's because of CO2, but then they'll turn around and go, oh, you got to watch the respiratory quotient, for like, because even though the carb thing and sugar is being demonized, that is still kind of an insurgent idea. And the old idea is that high fat diet causes, the original obesity research in animals and in humans was done with high fat diets, which were probably also high in sugar. Like, who cares? Like, they didn't really parse it out too well. But there were old professors that would kind they would have agreed with me if I was using just different language to say why I think it's not a great idea to like ramp up your fat really high and push down carbs. But because I talked about things like CO2, they're like, no, we don't have, like, that's not part of our vocabulary. And we're done learning new vocabulary.
You're talking about the respiratory quotient, because I remember somebody making an argument like that's bad because that was associated with obesity or something. But whatever. What's your elevator pitch for carbon dioxide, and when was that something that you started integrating into your thoughts?
Well, I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of really hard evidence because there hasn't been like studies on CO2 and CO2 therapy, but when like a pretty clear biomarker of aging and disease is decreased blood CO2, which basically means increased fatty acid oxidation compared to glucose. And so that's like just a universally like, oh, that's bad. Like if that dropped a lot, it's one of those things that the doctors don't really care about because it's not like there's not a pill that they can prescribe for like a cholesterol, where they're like, oh, great, I know how to do that. Here's, a statin yeah, it's pretty much like regarded as a bad thing if, say, when you were 30, I forget what normal CO2 numbers are. I haven't looked at those labs for a while, but whatever, if it dropped by like, what are they, like parts per, do you know the units for blood CO2?
Not off the top of my head. I'm sure the chat probably knows. Guys,
yeah.
What is it?
If they drop, if your blood CO2 was to drop by like 50% from, maybe in like a few years in a regular blood panel, that would be like, oh, that's a bad thing. Like maybe that's a problem. And it's pretty obvious why that would happen. Like there's basically two reasons. One, you're hyperventilating all the time, which is unlikely and pretty easy to figure out, like by just, are you? And I guess you could be doing it at night, and then the second is that your body has switched over to oxidizing a higher proportion of fatty acids to carbohydrate.
Well, here, I'll read what you wrote. So you said at the molecular level, CO2 is necessary for respiration through its displacement of oxygen on hemoglobin. And so that better allows like cells, tissues, and organs to absorb oxygen. And then at the tissue level, CO2 relaxes the smooth muscle around vessels, allowing for dilation. In hypocapnic low blood CO2 conditions, the nitric oxide system, which inhibits respiratory enzymes, is mobilized to ensure dilation. So like the nitric oxide system fills in for a lack of carbon dioxide, but as Ray pointed out, its fill-in has detrimental effects by turning off mitochondrial respiration. And go ahead.
Well, I was going to fill in the biochemistry real quick. So the hemoglobin, the heme, the reason why, so it's set up to be, it's a tetramer. And so each subunit, it's called positive cooperativity. So like a hemoglobin that gets sent to the lungs, the first oxygen that it binds changes the shape so that it's more likely to bind a second, third, and then fourth oxygen in that high oxygen environment of the lungs. And then it travels throughout the body and, gives up its oxygen and picks up CO2. And it does the same thing in reverse. It picks up, it kicks off one oxygen for a CO2, and then that makes the second oxygen more likely to get kicked off and replaced by a CO2. So the higher the carbon dioxide pressure inside and outside of the cells, the faster and more efficient oxygen transfer is. So if you had no CO2, like if just magically it was being like taken out of your body while it's produced, oxygen, probably insufficient to live, oxygen will be delivered to the cells at all. Of course, like, that's not what happens. What happens is there's these like little changes, but obviously it's not good to, hyperventilation is when you don't have any carbon dioxide and your brain doesn't get any oxygen. And just that statement alone, kind of explains how that works.
Yeah, you're saying it's a reciprocal approach, allowing for the use of oxygen. And I mean, correct me if I'm explaining this wrong, but like the protein, fat, and carbohydrate get reduced into electrons and like hacky sacked through the cell, donated to oxygen. But that process is not really clear how efficient that process is occurring without enough carbon dioxide. Is that right?
Well, that's another question, and that's Ray's. His idea that ATP is created just by taking water out of the cell with carbon dioxide, as bicarbonate and dissolved bicarbonate. But just at the level of oxygen delivery. I mean, the enzymes are designed so. If you wanted to have an enzyme deliver oxygen to tissues and cells that need it, you wouldn't want it to dump its oxygen in a place where there's already a lot of oxygen and not a lot of CO2. So just from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense that these enzymes would give up their oxygen in the areas of highest carbon dioxide pressure and pick up oxygen in the areas of the highest oxygen, the lungs. Like hemoglobin isn't taking oxygen, from like your liver, like from the circulation around it. That wouldn't make any sense, right? It's like it takes it from the lungs where the oxygen pressure is overwhelming. So it's just a pure biochemical effect.
Well, I haven't done that much investigation into this, but I know in one of Ray's newsletters, he thought that carbon dioxide called mitochondria into existence, and like the mitochondrial biogenesis or whatever. And I know that can be, I know I have some papers about thyroid hormone doing that, but I think the same thing might happen when you go to altitude.
Yeah, I kind of stopped looking into all that stuff, like the whole Gilbert Lang thing. But I think the idea is that these different dissolved gases and ions in the cell, like, formed the like prototypes for mitochondria, like created these intracellular environments in the structured water that would make it favorable for these things to form, and then over time they developed like specialized structures. That's always been really interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll the one thing you did write about, and again, Chris Masterjohn and Ray have both echoed this, and again, it's integral to my understanding, but additionally, the rate of vitamin K dependent carboxylation reactions is determined by the carbon dioxide concentration. And so to me, this really makes a case for the metabolic rate being, if you, a part of the nutrition. Like people are talking a lot about vitamin K. Of course, it's like very important, has all these nice functions. But if you were low thyroid and hence not producing a lot of carbon dioxide, or you didn't live at altitude, you lived at sea level or whatever, like this important vitamin might not be really used accordingly.
Yeah. And it's just like, it evolved in a situation where there's carbon dioxide for it to use. And I guess if you consider carbon dioxide a waste product, it would never occur to you that would have any kind of, it's like, oh, you have this symptom that has to do with vitamin K, just take more vitamin K. Like that would never come up. Like a doctor would never think, oh, maybe it's because, look at your labs from like 2 years ago and this year, and it's like your blood CO2 went down by 20% or something. They would never put that together. But yeah, but it's very easy to just call up the literature and show that, say that the KM or whatever kinetics that they're measuring for the rate of these enzymes are more affected by carbon dioxide pressure than by the number of, or the concentration of vitamin K.
I mean, we talked about it before, but were you ever convinced that it was just a matter of nutrition, like just getting the most nutrient density? Because that is a very common thread among current kind of carnivore / zero-carb people online. It's like, just get in the most nutrient dense food and you'll be okay,
Doesn't that beg the question though? Like dense in what?
Well, that's what I'm talking about. I don't think there's any glue holding lots of these ideas together.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm motivated to talk to you. But I mean, that was a compelling idea to me, at certain times. I think kind of after the meat and water thing, because there were a lot of people saying that meat had everything you needed, you know, and it was actually good that your body created its own glucose. It's actually good that you provide beta carotene and then you turn it into vitamin A. And that way you're not overloading the body or whatever with things that it doesn't necessarily need. But then when you frame it in the context of stress, like none of that makes really any sense, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, that is a good reason why the paleo or ancestral perspective does make sense to start from. Like, so if humans have been or haven't been eating something for a long time, there's probably a reason, you know? And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's good or bad, but like, I think humans and dogs, or there's one or two other mammals that can't produce vitamin C de novo. And so that, like, a piece of information like that would suggest, like, oh, either humans were consuming vitamin C more than other mammals, and they didn't, you know, they lost, either never had or lost the ability to produce it de novo, or they have some other compensating thing that they don't need vitamin C. So that kind of an approach makes sense, but then they just kind of use it like, oh, my cortisol is going up, and it's like, oh, well, then cortisol going up must be good. That was actually
must have survival value.
that was the thesis of, I think, in 2017, AHS Amber O'Hearn gave a talk, and it was basically questioning. It was like, oh, you know, doctor, like, we don't really know cortisol or any of the other stuff that a lot of, like, you know, mainstream science or medicine would say is like bad in a kind of abstract way. In some contexts, we don't know that that's bad. And one of her points was a lot of the science was done on people that were eating, you know, a high carb diet or like a standard American diet. So if you're eating this diet and you have elevated cortisol, maybe that means it's bad or maybe that's harmful. But if you're eating like a carnivore diet and you have elevated cortisol, maybe that's good. And there's a certain kind of sense to what she's saying, but you can kind of tell that after a while, like, oh, okay, so you're just arguing from the position that everything that is a result of the diet you prefer has to be good, and let's retroactively engineer that, rather than like starting from a more neutral questioning position.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I've often heard that this is our natural human diet, like, and people always just like make up some fantasy about like we didn't have access to food, and so therefore we were fasting most of the time and eating one meal a day. You know, it's like I think that's such a like hyper speculative way of approaching things. I'm not saying it can't pose questions and you can't answer them, like the vitamin C and stuff. But like that, it just doesn't seem, at least in my super limited experience, like a fruitful way to frame things, you know. And also, it's not why is it not possible for us to become better? You know, like couldn't I just make some extremely artificial environment that provided a lot of things that natural environment didn't have, and I could become better for it? You know, like a really enriched environment or something like that. So. It's I don't know. It's like that. It's naturalistic fallacy or whatever they call it. But
Yeah. Did you see a few years ago there was a big paper, like anthropological nutrition, I guess would be the field, where you know, there's still like a handful of hunter-gatherer societies. There's not many, and they found that this one, they were like, oh yeah. It ends up that, like, in some cases, they'll consume enormous percentages of their calories from honey. Like, they'll go out, like, the men will go out and gather honey for like a week. And when the men are out doing that, like 70% of their calories is just from like just eating honey. And they bring it back for the women and the children later. And so different times a year, they have all this carbohydrate, and that kind of thing isn't present in like archaeological sites the way that animal bones would be. And so that's, you know, that's just one of the things where it's like, okay, and you know, like cooking tools survive. So it's like you can say people were eating, you can make a very strong case that some people were eating something because there's animal bones there. there's cooking tools, so they were doing, but you can't really make a compelling case that they weren't eating something that would be 100% decomposed and biodegraded, because it's not there, you know? So that's one of the weaknesses there. And that's like a pretty big pillar, I think, of the paleo perspective, like stuff found at archaeological sites. So.
Good point. The last thing I want to talk about, the carbon dioxide, is you did make a good point that it's like helping the cell maintain its water balance. And what could you detect, like a tumor, by the amount of water in the cell? And so, again, it's just reiterating the importance of carbon dioxide. Do you want to explain that a little bit better than I did?
Yeah, liquid water versus, or bulk water versus structured water. So that's how MRIs work. So normally, potassium, you know, there's a lot more potassium inside of the cells than outside, and vice versa with sodium. And the potassium is kind of loosely bound around proteins, and so it can't move very much. But if there's a part of the cell that the water is not closely associated with proteins and structured, and it's more like a loose bulk, like what we think of when we think of water, like a flowing, the potassium that's dissolved in that water is much more free to move. And dividing cells, which cancer is doing all the time, have more of that liquid flowing water in them. So that's how MRIs work, is they excite the potassium. And if it takes a long time to stop, to let off the excitatory energy and stop spinning, then that means there's more bulk water in the cells. And so CO2, it leaves the cell, and just because of its chemical nature, it brings water with it. So if there's like a constant stream of CO2 getting produced, it leaves, you know, according to like just diffusion. And as it diffuses out, it takes out bulk water. It doesn't take out the structured water. You know, it can't like rip that away the same way as just the floating liquid water. So it just changes it drives higher CO2 leaving the cell, just drives the ratio of bulk water down compared to structured.
Amazing. How are you doing on time and everything, by the way?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay,
just hanging.
I just want to make sure, because we're taking our time. Okay,
yeah,
so
still talking about CO2.
Yeah. Okay, we can kind of rush through this, but I do want to get to insulin resistance. Is what I really want to talk about, but maybe we should just jump to that. So thyroid and carbon dioxide are obviously inextricably linked, as you mentioned in this paper. T3 is required to produce steroid hormones. It's like a cofactor for cellular respiration, but also the production of pregnenolone, progesterone, and DHEA, which is LDL cholesterol, vitamin A, and active thyroid hormone. Control of the heart rate and the heat production. Despite the name of thyroid gland, most of the body's T3 is produced in the liver by converting T4 into T3. And what was the main thing I wanted to get out of
that
this?
paper has a lot of information.
Go say it again?
That paper has a lot of information.
I know, that's why I think it's a good paper you did. And then you say hypoglycemia basically turns down thyroid, and the liver is like a proxy for the amount of glucose, you know, and because the liver is converting the thyroid hormones, it when the hypoglycemia or low insufficient blood sugar will turn down the production of T3. And so you said thus a low carbohydrate diet appears to be a T3 suppressive diet. And I, like you mentioned before, I totally understand that people think that having low T3 promotes longevity or whatever, but we're offering a counterpoint basically.
Do they think that?
What was that guy? He's kind of fell out of favor, but he was kind of older. You probably saw him at AHS, like Rosen something. Do you know who I'm talking about?
No.
He was like a huge proponent of like having lower thyroid and things like that. And again, I think it ties back to that Raymond Pearl rate of living theory, and that we're rusty old cars and that we want to just slow everything down. But again, I don't know about you, but like I feel like I've experienced that to my core, you know, of having my metabolism turned down, being cold all the time, and then the many different effects from that stem from that, you know, like you don't feel like having sex when you're freezing, you know, like, and so I could say with a lot of confidence that that feels horrible, you know? And so, and so that's why I feel, again, like I could say it confidently that I don't think that's a good way to live for a long time. I don't know.
Yeah, I have an anecdotal experience with that. When I was in grad school and I was like shifting away from a really restrictive low carb, like the mostly raw meat diet, I spent a lot of time for a while at the inside of Barnes and Noble, the Starbucks cafes that they have there, studying, or like I was teaching and grading papers, just grad school stuff. I really liked that environment for some reason. And in a lot of those retail stores, they keep them at a temperature that is comfortable if you're moving around,
Yeah.
like the workers.
Yeah.
But if you're sitting still for like 2 hours
Yeah.
and you don't eat anything, like all of a sudden you realize, wow, I'm like freezing. And that's when I first noticed, like I would show up and feel fine, and I would sit down and start working, and an hour or two would go by, and then I'd be like, man, I feel like crap, and I feel so cold. And then I would go get something like a latte and like a stuffed pretzel, or just like whatever crap they sell there, and I
Ambiance.
would feel my body like warm up
Yeah.
and stop being cold almost immediately.
Well, it's funny you say that, because so I worked at Apple retail for like 5 years, and you had to go through a Starbucks Barnes and Noble to get to the store. And so you're totally right. It was always kept freezing. And then when I worked at Apple, we were all given like one Apple shirt to wear, and I would layer 3 of them on top of each other. And then I would also wear a hoodie. And like I had to like ask for a Apple hoodie so I could wear it at work. But what was really sad was the girls that worked there, like petite, small girls, were just wearing their normal shirt. And I was freezing out of my mind, and again, because I was fasting I adopted that 1 meal a day thing pretty quickly, and I'd be fasting all day until I got home, and my body temperature was just decrease throughout the day, and I'd be like intolerably cold before I ate, and then warm up afterwards. But I could safely say it felt miserable, and I have no idea why I stuck to it for so long, but yeah, just slow decline. And also my mood got worse and worse and worse as the day went on, because of the stress. Okay,
Yeah.
so kind of your bread and butter, but the insulin resistance, one of the more understood areas of macronutrient physiology is the Randle cycle, or substrate competition between glucose and fatty acids. You want to elevator pitch for this? Because I had never even heard of this until I encountered Great Pete.
Yeah. This is taught in like the normal like physiology classes, when I was in grad school, but it's not given much of an implication. It's just like, it's kind of like the citric acid cycle. It's just, oh, this is how this works, like this elegant, oh, isn't it great that instead of burning, the body has the ability to choose if there's like a lot of one macronutrient, it can use that, and that's, more efficient. And so that's how it's usually taught, but it's never taught as like, isn't it interesting that the problem with type 2 diabetes is blood sugar, and that the liver won't stop putting out sugar, and also unrelatedly the products of fat metabolism inhibit glucose metabolism, and vice versa, and those two are never really put together as like a cause of anything. But yeah, basically through the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, that's kind of the master switch for whether you're going to be primarily using glucose for the full like oxidation all the way to CO2, or you're going to be making like a little bit more lactic acid and using more beta oxidation of fats, and that some of the products of beta oxidation turn down the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, and the products of glucose oxidation turn it up and turn down beta oxidation. So they switch each other up and down.
You said a great thing here. So you say the reduction of glycemia seen in low-carb dieting is not a sign of increased insulin sensitivity, but simply a removal of the challenge. An analogy is the removal of dairy from the lactose-intolerant diet. The reduction seen in their symptoms does not reflect an improvement in their ability to handle dairy. Oh yeah, that was And then you say a sign of metabolic health is the flexibility between the glucose and fat, because you're going to go to sleep. You're going to start liberating fatty acids and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But this is kind of this idea was first implanted in my head by like Matt Stone. Do you remember him?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So he was like kind of making this point, and so yeah, and so you say fatty acid oxidation is synonymous with some degree of glucose intolerance. And then in our last chat on the podcast, that was our popular podcast, was you were saying that a lot of the sugar in diabetes is coming from I'm sorry, the gluconeogenesis liver, correct? Yeah. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I forget what the numbers are, but that's not like a controversial statement. Like that's just the well-known clinical fact that the main problem with hyperglycemia in insulin resistant driven diabetes or type 2 diabetes is that rather than the dietary glucose just not being able to clear, like it does clear more slowly, but the real thing that keeps glycemia up over time, especially obviously in the fasted state, is that regardless of glycemia, the liver just doesn't stop making more and secreting it into the blood.
Did you do the other kind of switch in perspective? Was I used to say, oh, well, like diabetes or insulin resistance means you can't use the sugar. But Ray referenced a series of papers that I had read saying that the like diabetes was synonymous with higher levels of lactic acid. So it was being used, but it was just being driven through glycolysis and spitting out lactic acid, presumably because that pyruvate dehydrogenase was blocked. And so, but what I was saying earlier, I don't know if people still say that necessarily, but it was just completely wrong, because a person can use it, but they're not fully oxidizing it,
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends what you mean by use.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Sweet. Okay, so we're at the PUFA. Is there anything you feel compelled, like you want to mention? Because we're nearing kind of the end of at least your paper here.
I think there's a line in there, if I remember, about how the low carb metabolism has aspects of, I think, starvation and of diabetes.
It's like a remix.
Yeah.
I know I've read where you said that, but I don't remember exactly where.
Yeah, it has the enhanced cortisol and gluconeogenesis and everything of the diabetic metabolism, and the fatty acid mobilization, and I guess lactic acid, all that stuff of the diabetes metabolism. But it has the low glycemia of somebody that's not eating, like a fasted. So it's kind of like this combination of not eating and being diabetic.
Well, here we could kind of conclude on this, but shoot, I was just gonna ask you something. I forgot. The thing is, the thing that needs to be contextualized is when somebody is saying, "Hey, I'm gonna go on a carnivore, keto, or low carb diet," all different varying degrees of lipolysis, presumably. You can't negate the fact that most likely you have been exposed to a lot of polyunsaturated fats over the years that are in your tissues. And so, like, just because you go on a carnivore diet or keto or whatever, and you stopped eating PUFA like a week ago, and you're liberating all these fats, that's like a really risky proposition, like for lipid peroxidation. And what you write here, you say plant seed oils and cold water fish have many very different metabolisms and physiological needs than mammals. The suppressive actions on PUFA may explain why one of the symptoms of so-called essential fatty acid deficiency is a 25 to 30% increase in the basal metabolic rate. Thyroid hormone, discussed above, the master metabolic regulator, which I would agree with, is blocked by at the production, transport, and cellular action steps by PUFA. If fat in the context of mammalian systems is a storage fuel to be used during emergencies, PUFA is an agent by which that system is slowed for preservation over the course of the emergency. Like inappropriately, it's like it's not even having a. I don't want to speak for you. Like, do you want to expand on any of that?
Yeah, I guess just the idea that I don't know if this is in the paper, but when mammals, like humans and a lot of other mammals are fed carbohydrate and they make lipids de novo, they make mostly saturated,
Uh-huh.
and they make some monounsaturated, and they make pretty much no polyunsaturated. So if you combine that with everybody knows that meat, generally speaking, and that pork is like a different category, and to some extent poultry as well, but red meat at least is high in saturated fat. So whereas plant oils, if you can extract them, um, some of them require a lot of technology to extract, and the fish in cold water versus fish in warm water have more PUFA. It just seems pretty clear that saturated fats are storage substrate for animals that are warm, either in like warm water or have, unlike fish and reptiles and stuff, have a high body temperature just all the time, and that the unsaturated fats are around things that are cold. Um, there's pretty much no exception to that. And it's hard to find any kind of hard science about that because it's not. I don't know. It's just not a compelling question to people. I guess especially since saturated fat was unpopular for a long time. But yeah, the idea that there's something inherent about PUFA that it's not just a coincidence. It's not just random that they're present in all of these low metabolic rate cold organisms, and that saturated fats are present in the opposite, and that there's probably a mechanistic thing going on.
Before we traverse over, like, do you have any specific point of view of the EPA and DHA? Because this is actually something. My little investigation of the carnivore scene, they actually a lot of them adopt the idea that these are essential and that you need EPA and especially DHA. So is that something you have a strong point of view on?
Not really. The thing with the essential fatty acids is even if they are essential, the level that humans need to take them in is so low that you can hardly even avoid it. Like you would have to eat a very specialized diet
Mm-hmm.
to even get less than the essential level of essential fatty acids.
Uh-huh.
And the other thing is, in animals and humans, the symptoms of essential fatty acid deficiency are what's really weird is because supposedly those longer chain, EPA, DHA, whatever the longer chain N3, N6, arachidonic, they're supposed to be the active forms, so you take in like linoleic acid or linolenic acid, and they get elongated and desaturated until they're 20 or 22 or 24 carbons long, whereas they start as 16 or 18. But the symptoms of essential fatty acid deficiency, and this is mostly done in rats and mice, are corrected more quickly with linoleic and linolenic acid than with the longer chain PUFA, which doesn't make any sense really. And I don't really even have an answer for why that would be, but it just it definitely asks a big question. Like if the point of those fatty acids is that they make these longer chain fatty acids that are activate nuclear receptors, like the PPAR receptors and those kinds of things, or produce prostaglandins that are necessary for this or that, or any kind of eicosanoid metabolism, then you would think that consuming the fatty acids that are closer to that end result would at least have equivalent effect at suppressing the so-called symptoms of essential fatty acid deficiency, but they don't. So, and of course, essential fatty acid deficiency, it's really hard to find that in humans at all,
Uh-huh.
even when they're starved.
Something you said a long time ago, it was like investigative journalism to find some of Ray's references. I thought that
Yeah.
was so funny because I was like, yes, I totally. He's like mentioned something in passing, and it's taken me like a week to find the paper or something. Like, it's funny because you'd
A
understand this.
week, that's nothing. I've taken years.
Well, it's funny. Like, I'd be interested in your perspective on this, but I think he comes from like just such a different time in biology that, yeah, maybe in physiology or whatever, it was like well known that estrogen increases prolactin. But I was like having a really difficult time finding anything that say it straight up. And then eventually I found a reference that said like estrogen increases every conceivable way that prolactin could rise or whatever. But it took me like a while to find that. But he says it without referencing it or whatever, presumably because it's just like so well known that you don't need to put a number next to it. I don't know.
Yeah, like my favorite one is like he'll say something like some French.
Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Some French people fed, fatty acids to pregnant women, and it's like, and then you got to find that, and it's just, is this like a recent thing, or was this at a party, or what?
Is it a party you went to, or what?
Yeah.
Yeah, dude, that's the best when he says something in an interview and you're trying to find it. Yeah, that can be really challenging. Okay, still good on time and everything, because I can shift over to questions here.
Yeah.
Okay, and just a brief pause. Thank you, Kyle, so much for joining me. So fun to talk to you. Thank you, everybody in the chat. And yeah, you guys are amazing. Thank you guys so much. This one's from Eli. He says, what are practical, and I don't want to put you on the spot. Like if you're like, I haven't studied that or whatever, like don't worry about it. Not that you wouldn't say that anyways, but Eli says, what are practical ways to deplete your body reserves of polyunsaturated fatty acids safely? Do you have any perspective on that?
Yeah, well, I've gotten that question. I think I responded to that in the comments of one of the AHS videos.
Mm-hmm.
And, the fast way, you could do it really fast on like a high saturated fat, high fat diet. If you're comfortable with like releasing all of these fatty acids in the system. From our perspective, that's not like a safe or like recommended thing to do, but it's just a matter of decreasing your intake and increasing your metabolic rate as much as you can. And anything that, the whole brown fat thing and beige fat,
mm-hmm.
which is when white adipocytes take on a quasi brown fat phenotype and start ramping up their metabolism for things like heat production.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that would turn that up without increasing lipolysis would burn up the extant fats in your fatty acids as quick as possible. But yeah, there's no like, this one weird food, like doctors hate it. It burns up PUFA in the, Ray Pete hates this one weird trick to burn up PUFA in the cells. There's really nothing like that. I don't think there's a way to preferentially target PUFA for, I have heard Ray say, and this makes sense, that they get released slightly preferentially because they're more water soluble because of their double bonds versus saturated fats. And so that's bad. That means they get mobilized faster during lipolysis. And it also means they get preferentially stored because they would interact with the enzymes that are putting them into the adipocytes and putting them into fat depots a little bit, like probably single-digit percentage more than saturated fats, but over time, that would cause those stores to be higher. But yeah, you just have to decrease your intake and increase your metabolism as much as you can. That's really all you can do, as far as I know.
I forgot what his point was, but do you remember Andrew Kim, brief blogging? I remember him really disagreeing with Ray on the preferential release of the PUFA, but somebody did hit him up fairly recently, and I remember him supplying lots of detail about it. But
he also disagreed with Ray on the half-life.
Yeah.
Fatty acid storage. But it really wasn't. I mean, it was like 2 years versus 4 years or something, and it's like, I mean, there's no practical effect to whether it's longer or shorter. You still do the same thing. I mean, the decreasing your PUFA intake and trying to increase your metabolism is something that I would recommend, regardless of whether you think you have like this toxic PUFA depot, or not. That's just a good thing to do.
Fair enough. Stefan Highland says, what are your views on fasting and autophagy And also, what are your views on dairy? So fasting and autophagy first. I'm glad he asked this because do you have a perspective on that? Because that is another thing that people say as the longevity aspect of low carb or fasting or whatever.
Yeah, I think that fasting has short-term benefits, like short-term symptomatic benefits, and it definitely turns up autophagy. Uh, and I guess that could be good, but I'm not really. There hasn't really been a lot of long-term stuff on that, and I guess the strongest long-term stuff is the calorie restriction stuff, which may or may not be done with fasting. Like I think that different groups, you know, spread out the calorie restricted meals, you know, without big fasting periods, and some just restrict the number of meals per day. And I think they get basically the same results, and the same results have been obtained from methionine restriction. So it it seems like something that, like, there's not a whole generation of people that are like, oh yeah, I've been fasting for like 40 years, so I guess we'll see. I mean, it obviously does increase autophagy, and in some contexts, you can see how that's a good thing.
I don't want to speak for him. I think Ray's perspective was that all these other bad things are happening during
Right.
the autophagy. So you can't really say, oh, there's that good thing when the fatty acids are being released, the activation of the stress systems, lipid peroxidation, etc. And I think that maybe that's what was his argument for ketones, but I think that might apply for the autophagy. And
Right.
also,
The
I think,
ketones are good, but how you get to them is bad.
yeah, exactly. Maybe I'm actually being a little bit confused, but uh, and also, I think he somewhere in one of his papers said that thyroid increased autophagy, and so does like trehalose, some chemical in mushrooms or something. So I don't know if that's necessarily like the only way to do it is to fast or go on a keto or zero carb diet.
Yeah, I think that's just well, to put that into perspective a little bit, fasting also increases heat production temporarily.
Mm-hmm.
So like you can get thermogenic effects. Like we were saying how it made us feel cold.
Yeah.
So you can feel cold from not eating, but it can also temporarily boost like your metabolism to fast for some period. So because obviously it makes sense that the human animal, you don't want to just be like, oh well, there's not enough food, so let's just shut down. You have to get more food. So, but it's kind of like runner's high.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Like it feels, you get this elation from just running your body ragged, you
Yeah.
know, in a long distance. And so obviously you could, on the face of it, you could say, oh, well, it feels good, so that's probably doing something good. But it could also be like, oh, that's a survival mechanism. Like these are short-term survival mechanisms. And there's not a lot of compelling evidence that they're long-term. There's a lot of short-term studies that suggest that they're healthy long-term. That's really all there is. There's no long-term study on fasting. Like there's nobody that started a study in the 70s on a bunch of fasted people or calorie restricted people and are like collecting data on them now. You know, this is all like in the past 20 years when these questions started being asked.
And like you said, it's a sticky situation. Like if there's chronic inflammation in the intestine, like yeah, like not eating would probably
Mm-hmm.
ameliorate that inflammation to some degree. Okay, so Lucien Burke says a pillar of the ketogenic diet, fasting, biohacking culture is that hormesis is good. What does Kyle think about hormesis and adaptation to environment stress as a virtue? It seems that Ray Pete doesn't believe in hormesis at all, especially on a dietary level. Can I like interject a little bit? I think I don't wanna, again, I don't want to speak for him, but I think his view is that in the current state of things, like hormesis has no value. But what do you think?
Um, I think that what people consider hormesis is probably not good, but we're always adapting to the environment, you know, and like a simple thing, like if you were strapped to a bed, like you were a bedridden patient or something, your muscles would atrophy because they're not being challenged by holding your body weight.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That to me could be considered hormesis. Like there's a stress on your skeletal muscles, and it causes them to be uh, bigger and have a higher, metabolism compared to the rest of your body than they otherwise would be if you were living on like a gravity-less planet or something. But what people consider stress, like there's so many different, uses of that word. There's like the popular just, oh, I feel stressed today.
Yeah.
And there's the like old school scientific use of it, which is like kind of anything that would cause these symptoms that we're talking about, like hormone sensitive lipase to get activated and for gluconeogenesis to get turned up, or the adrenals to get turned on or something like that. That would be considered stress in the animal. And then there's stress like the kind of, oh, I took a cold shower, and so I turned up X, Y, and Z, and I think it's good to do that for 3 minutes every morning, and it makes me, and I don't know, maybe that's good, maybe it's bad, but it's like, I think Ray is responding to the concept of stress, like, let's abuse our bodies in more creative ways to make them stronger. Like, it's always better to be, pushing the envelope on that, and that any kind of like stable thing is going to cause weakness. And I think he disagrees with that. And the way I see it, there is no stable, like from our perspective, because we're in our bodies and we're in our environment, we can't understand that there is actually a more stable situation. Like we could be in like a tank with like, like we could be like in a medically induced coma in a tank, kept at the perfect temperature with like nutrients being exchanged intravenously. And that would be a more stable and in a lot of ways less stressful situation than being out here like breathing oxygen, which is in and of itself like a stress, a stressor of a certain type. It's just necessary. So the hormesis, it's a question of like degree, because everything is adaptive.
Well, the way I always thought of it, and what I mean, I can't speak for him perfectly, but like in a person that is saturated with PUFA, and again in our less than ideal culture, toxic culture, etc., toxic food, like there are so many bad aspects of the culture that are contributing to bad health. Like nutrition is just one of them. And so, like you said, thinking about new ways to stress ourselves when we're already, like whether you perceive it or not, being inundated with stress is just out of the ballpark, just not useful. And again, I can't speak for him or any, but that like the Gabor Mate, the traumatism of the culture, like nobody's getting out of this unscathed. And so when somebody's talking about hormesis, I guess they're thinking we're starting from some level of playing field or something, which is just not right. The case,
Yeah. And I'm saying that there is no, like, living things they're not in a vacuum.
Yeah.
they're in their environment, and that environment has, things that cause them to behave in ways to avoid certain things. Like, it's just, people say like this is stress, like everything. It's just like a real sloppy language, and it became like a popular thing. And it's like, oh, I'm gonna like go farther away from my computer monitor to cause my eyes to have to focus farther. You know what I mean? Like, and it's like, okay, fine, like biohack yourself. I'm sure there's a lot of things like techniques people could do, whether it's exercise techniques or like sleeping in a different position or like whatever, that could be good, and some of them could be bad, and some of them could be good short term and bad long term.
You're right. It can be varied, and I guess Ray's one of the things he brought up was like the nuclear industry saying that low level radiation was a hormesis, and so I think this gentleman's talking about more of like I've mostly heard it talked about with low carb and keto, but you're right. There are so many different instances where it could be invoked. Yeah.
I think that there is probably some type of, like, say exercise. It's there's probably a good amount of exercise, and then like overtraining, and that's just like a real simple, where there's some health benefits to like say lifting weights like 3 times a week at like a moderate to high intensity for like 45 minutes, or to like let's just like take that as the given. And then less than that or nothing would not give you those benefits. And more than that would give you less benefits or start to create problems. So I think there's a curve like that for everything, but it's different for different people, and it's different at different ages. And, you know.
Well said. Super well said.
But the first question, actually, the second part was about dairy.
Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped that. Yeah, go for it.
I'm pro dairy. And I know a lot of people have like trouble with dairy, and I've never had, actually, supposedly when I was a baby, I had trouble with dairy, but I don't remember it. But I don't have trouble with dairy now. And, you know, there's the stories of people that like, oh, you know, if you just introduce small amounts, you can overcome problems consuming dairy. And then but some people seem to have real issues with it. So I just like a practical advice would just be, if you tolerate dairy well and it doesn't give you negative symptoms, then consume dairy if you like it.
For what it's worth, I had like chronic diarrhea whenever drinking milk after zero carb. It was horrible. You know, like 45 minutes after drinking it, it was very bad. And I had heard Ray on one of the podcasts say that he thought it was like chronic inflammation in the intestine. And I was like, I'm being so careful with my diet. I don't understand how that's possible. But I think I had developed some kind of overgrowth or something during the vegan zero carb or whatever, one of those pathological situations. And upon taking penicillin for like 2 weeks, I could digest milk, goat milk fine, which was unbelievable to me, especially since I was living with people and it was extremely embarrassing. And so that was, again, part of my like conditioning of being like, man, I think this guy is onto something, because that was like a pain point for me. Because I like milk. I wanted to drink it. I didn't want to just be like, oh, you know, fuck it. Like this is not an appropriate food for the species, because I had done that so many times in the past, you know? So it was like, and Ray was talking about it being such like a benign food. And so I was like, why can't I tolerate it? Okay. Kathy says, how to reverse insulin resistance. So what do you think are some practical things? You kind of mentioned it already, like the restricting PUFA. What was the other thing? Oh, increasing the metabolic rate.
I mean, that's like a serious medical condition. And so I think that warrants, like, because normally I don't recommend, like, I don't tell strangers, like, you know, to do an extreme diet, because I just don't think that's, you know, responsible anymore. But in a situation like that where you have a medical condition, I think that is worth trying something kind of extreme, and just a very low fat diet, where the only fats you're taking in, you know, would be like maybe some dairy fats if you're having dairy with coffee, and just try to keep your fat as low as possible, like less than 10% of calories maybe as a target. And I think a diet like that for a few months is probably, you know, would reverse. I'd be surprised if fasting glucose and glucose tolerance did not improve on a regimen like that.
Do you remember, I think it was maybe at AHS, Denise Minger was talking about like sub 5% level dietary fat diets. And like slightly above that actually was when the insulin resistance would like begin. So she was, I wish I had read the paper before, but it was pretty interesting how
she
low.
had a blog post where she said 10%.
Okay.
But she might have also said a lower percent. I mean, from the perspective of what appears to be causing insulin resistance, which is probably substrate competition and endotoxin. If you can just get all fat out of your diet temporarily, endotoxin the absorption will be cut down to almost nothing. So assuming that those seem to be the most supported by the literature mechanisms for what's actually causing insulin resistance, not like this vague kind of sugar crap that doesn't, you know, have any real mechanism. If that's true, then yeah, like the lowest you could go in fat would have the most benefit.
Well, again, you just reminded me of some other pieces of information that kind of led me to Ray, but there was a book that Matt Stone used to talk about called The Potbelly Syndrome. And I remember in that book, the author saying that he like referenced a study of diabetics taking antibiotics and becoming less diabetic in the process. And I was like, what? This is impossible. Like, how you have to drop your carbohydrate for that to happen. Like, but again, it was kind of like foreshadowing getting to Ray. And you're right. I have a paper saying that like the primary malfunction that endotoxin causes is lipolysis, and so like the diabetic metabolism, basically. Yeah, among other things, you know.
Yeah.
Cool. This Maxim Anderson says, a woman I know was heavily overweight and was type 2 diabetic. After going keto, she lost weight and her insulin and sugar issues normalized. Looking in a pragmatic, result-oriented fashion, she succeeded with the keto diet. What does Kyle think about these kind of keto success stories? Can we definitively discredit keto in the face of such positive evidence? I don't think we're trying to necessarily dismiss it, but I don't want to speak.
Yeah. There's just different ways to look at it. Like it's definitely true that if you have it's very likely that if you have high fasting glucose and really slow glucose disposal, like, clearance, that cutting carbs out of your diet will reduce those symptoms. Now, that's not necessarily true. If you have a seriously overworking liver that's pumping out a ton of, gluconeogenesis product into the blood, then you'll still have high blood glucose, but it'll probably be lower if you cut carbs out of your diet. Your fasting blood glucose will go down. Yeah, like if you cut vitamin B1 out of your diet, your blood vitamin B1 will go down. Like there's nothing like revelatory about that. Like that's true. And people lose weight on those diets, and it's probably, to kind of bring in Stefan Guillenet, who can't go any length of time without referencing him. There are definitely satiety effects when you cut out one of the macronutrients. So, and I'm sure people have experienced, like you've probably experienced this. If you have a meal without carbs, the food becomes unappealing faster. And if you have a meal without fat, the meal becomes unappealing faster. And if you were like full from a meal that was missing one of the macronutrients, and then you walk by and there's just like a plate of food that has all three macronutrients, you're not going to feel full anymore. In the face of like pizza or something, something that has like large amounts of all three macronutrients, especially carbs and fat. So yeah, it's like what you said before from the paper. Like if you remove glucose, and then your blood, the symptoms. So fasting blood glucose and glucose tolerance tests and insulin tolerance tests, those are all symptoms, and I guess you could call anything a symptom. Like you can just kind of go further into the cellular physiology to like, or, and say, this is a symptom of this, this causes this, causes this, causes this. But like something like fasting blood glucose is very much a symptom, because you can get rid of it by just not consuming. Well, you can reduce it by not consuming glucose for a couple days, and your fasting blood glucose should go down. But like, you didn't just cure diabetes. Like, it's, those are two separate things. Like, what would be a cure is if this woman got on the keto diet, lost her excess weight, had, a healthy, lean body, felt good, and her blood sugar numbers normalized, and then she could eat a high carb meal with a normal insulin and glucose response, and then just eat her keto meals or eat normal meals and have a normal metabolic response. But that's not what's going on. What's going on is she's just not consuming high carb meals. It's overwhelmingly likely that if she consumed a lot of carbs, her blood sugar would shoot up. It wouldn't come down very quickly. And so she didn't cure insulin resistance, and her insulin would be higher than, for say, a person with normal insulin metabolism would require to dispose of that amount of glucose. So she's still diabetic. Like,
Well said. The two things I want to point out is sometimes people say, "Oh, my blood work is fine," and again, that's like depending on who's interpreting it. You know, like there's a handful of popular YouTube people, carnivore, Zero-Carb, whatever, and their cholesterols are like astronomically high, like 300, 350. One guy's a 451, and like to me, I think that's a sign that the metabolic rate is like profoundly suppressed. You know, but again, they're saying, "Oh, it's normal," you know, or it's favorable, or whatever their specific argument is. And so again, that I think always has to be thought about. And then two, this might not be super related, but like a lot of people like because I talk about hair loss a lot, like somebody will say I take finasteride and I'm not affected at all by it, you know. And sometimes I'm like, how like what is the functioning of that person from day to day? Like you can't. Like you're a very intelligent person. Maybe your energy requirements are very high. And then when you don't get what you need to get, you notice quickly, you know? Whereas somebody that's like has a profoundly lower rate of metabolism wouldn't even notice that they weren't getting everything their body needed, you know? So that's why I always take like success stories online just with a grain of salt, you know? And that's why she said things normalize, you know? And again, I think the pulse and temperature are good, a good barometer for the rate of metabolism, and I guess by proxy health. But again, it's very complicated. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean that would be an interesting thing to ask these people. It's like, what's your postprandial, post meal temperature? Does your temperature go up, stay the same, or go down? What things like that. And not that that's again like a definitive thing, but there's just these numbers that people have decided like, okay, these are the things that have, if these things change in this way, then that means I've solved the problem and I'm healthy now. And, because there's more, it's the same thing with losing weight. Like you can lose weight in a healthy way, or you can just starve yourself. And from like, if you just had scale numbers and said, oh, look, the number on the scale is going down, but like from two different reasons, like one person like exercises a little bit and just improves their diet and loses a certain amount of weight, another person starves themselves. The scale numbers aren't telling those two stories.
Good point. Tommy says, what is Kyle's daily diet and supplement routine? So besides the omega-3s, the cod liver oil, the krill oil, besides those, what are you using?
Well, I start off with bulletproof coffee. Well, I told you before we started that I just this week because I haven't done a specific diet for a while. I've been doing restrictive diets, like I said, since about 2003 or 4, and since 2004, extremely like things where they consume a lot of your lifestyle.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty burnt out on that, and I don't really think that for most people they're necessary or even helpful, but I am starting a low-fat diet experiment just to see what happens. My weight has like fluctuated a little bit since adding carbs back. Like at first it went up and then it went down, and then it kind of went up again and then went down a little bit. And so I was going to say like, oh, maybe I could like lose some of that weight that I gained when I first like started doing Ray Peat stuff with a low-fat experiment. And also, I've never really done low fat except when I was a vegan. So it'd be interesting to see like, oh, what does it feel like to maybe, I'm not aware that I'm absorbing like X amount of endotoxin. Like maybe it'll feel different, So basically I've been, for breakfast, I try to make oatmeal and mix in like 8 or so grams, like whatever a scoop of Great Lakes collagen is. I think 2 scoops is 12 or 13 grams, one 6 to 7. And also glycine. I have a little bit of lysine, just, like collagen and some of the isolated amino acids that, are supposedly better. And then I put like sugar and whatever I want in there. Anything that's not fat.
You blend it with coffee.
Yeah. And butter. For lunch, like today I had rice and chicken. And some kind of, I don't know, like onions and ginger and stuff. I make coffee every day. I've been drinking goat's milk, so I've just been putting goat's milk in my coffee, sugar. So yeah, I don't have like I haven't counted calories ever, and I don't really. I just kind of know from being around like the nutrition scene for such a long time, like what is in what food. Like I don't need to count grams of fat to know more or less, if I'm getting like a low fat or how much protein or whatever.
Yeah.
And I don't take a lot of supplements. I take not even every day, but like if I make a smoothie, and usually when I make a smoothie, I'll take like some kind of frozen fruit and some milk. I'll put I have a couple bottles of like Thorn K2 and vitamin D. If I don't eat them for a while, sometimes I'll put them on my skin, but I'll just like dump them. If I'm eating something that has fat in it, I'll just sometimes dump them in there. I take aspirin every day. I used to take a lot, and I never noticed anything bad, but I take these like, I have this big bottle of like geriatric aspirin.
Jerry Care, yeah, I know what you're talking about. I bought it.
They're like 300 milligrams each or something.
Yeah, like
I used to take like 3 of those at a time to get like almost a gram of aspirin. And it was fine. I felt fine. Now I'll take like maybe just one, like twice a day. What else?
Well,
I experiment with things, but I almost never stick to a regimen where it's like, okay, I need to take this multivitamin, or like for a while I had a bottle of Georgie's Haydut's B complex,
Mhm.
and every morning I would pour a glass of orange juice and just drop some drops in there. And in orange juice, you don't even taste it.
Yeah.
So stuff like that. But then I'll run out, and I'll take a month to get it again. So it's always changing with me.
Sometimes I feel like that's good to let you or sometimes inadvertently let me know what the thing was doing. If you can run out of something and not feel any different, like that can be problematic. But occasionally, like I've started and stopped taking thyroid like 50 times. And when I would stop, like I'd like start waking up at 3 or 4 a.m. like every single night. And I'd be like, why is this happening again? Then I'd start taking it and it would go away. So that can be useful. It's not like you have to take things every single day.
Yeah, obviously, like the supplement industry is designed to make you take things that without reflecting on whether it's necessary or whether it's beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, you need this for this.
Mm-hmm.
And then you start taking it, and then you just kind of go, okay, this is what I take, and it's never really examined. So
sweet. Okay, last of these questions. Then I don't know if we got any super chats, but Joshua Watkinson says, "I'm only somewhat familiar with the arguments against sodium potassium pumps. How do these arguments hold up against seemingly well supported structural functional data for these pumps presented in textbooks?" So this is like a Gerald Pollack, Gilbert Ling idea. Like you mentioned it kind of in passing before, but do you have an opinion on it?
yeah.
You actually
So
said something brilliant that. Sorry, I'm sorry. Go ahead. But you actually mentioned this in our last podcast, I think.
Yeah. That's a really tough. So I haven't examined every piece of experimental literature on, the proof of the existence of like the sodium potassium pump protein and its cloning and the different assays that were done to show that it does the activity that it's supposed to do. But the way I look at it is, Gilbert Ling did a series of very simple experiments, like stuff with the cytoplasm without a membrane, and showing that things like cytoplasm and even hair follicles, pick up potassium preferentially. And he had a bunch of more like molecular experiments where he would show that when they would show the way that the potassium pump worked, the membranes were like inverted, so it should have been pumping the opposite direction. That's a little bit more complicated, but from what I know about molecular biology, experimental molecular biology, and biochemistry, it is extremely possible to have a protein, or usually a protein that you clone and you purify and you run through a list of assays, and it does the thing that you think it's doing because the way an assay is set up. And it's like a good analogy is estrogen receptor. Ray has suggested that that tons of proteins are estrogen sensitive, and that estrogen receptor, its main function is that it keeps estrogen in the cells longer. So it just makes these basically everything in the cell is estrogen sensitive, and the estrogen receptor. And if you think about that, that would have the exact same results. Like if estrogen receptor was the estrogen sensitive protein, or if it just kept the estrogen in the cells longer and at a higher concentration to affect nearly all proteins, because they're almost all estrogen sensitive, that would have the same results in a cellular assay. So I would have to that would be like a deep dive thing to look into the history of this. See, now I'm probably gonna have to do this, but the history of the sodium potassium pump and every point of kind of proof of its existence, its activity, because you don't in all of the different biomedical disciplines, it's extremely rare that you would have an experiment that is akin to like, we have the thing and we have a test that directly measures what this thing does in the way it does it in the cell. Like there's usually 2, 3, or 4, or an obscene number of, they're called coupled assays. So like instead of measuring the exact product of something, you measure the product of a product of the product of something. So you'll put in like a bunch of proteins and chemicals that will take like the product of the enzyme you're studying and make something, and then the product of that will make something, and then the product of that will turn on luciferase and cause like fluorescence or light to come on. And so I really can't comment like, oh, that science is bullshit or that science is valid. I can just say that it's imminently possible for it to go either way. And even if the sodium potassium pump does what it supposedly does, that doesn't mean that it's responsible for all of the different gradient in the cell. And until somebody can also demonstrate that proteins, that cytoplasm doesn't concentrate potassium and kick out sodium by itself, that because both things would have to happen. Like you can't disprove one mechanism by saying, oh, this also, because there's a lot of things that are redundant in biology. Like there's there's multiple ways to get like like you can make something in the body de novo and you can get it dietarily. So just because you can get it dietarily doesn't mean you can't make it de novo, and vice versa.
Doesn't Gerald Pollack in his Cells Gels book have like a am I like confusing this? I feel like he had a chapter saying, yeah, these structures do exist. Here's what I think they actually do. It was like towards the back or whatever. Have you read that? You've read that book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was over my head, but I do remember him like addressing, because the existence of them, he just didn't think their function was pumping and channeling and things.
I'll have to go back and look at that, because all I remember is that he was questioning because the size of the channels shouldn't be exclusionary to smaller ions. So there shouldn't be a channel that is exclusionary. Like, so potassium has a smaller hydrated radius than sodium. So if there's a channel that lets in sodium, then they both have a charge of +1. So and they're not a protein with a different shape. So that's when you get into like, okay, like the shape, they're just a circle with an electrical potential and a certain amount of water that is electrically associated with this ion, and it's a sphere. So there's basically potassium should be able to go through a sodium channel, and any ion that's smaller and the same charge of another ion should be able to use its channel. So I remember him saying that, and yeah, I can't really think of any reason why that would be wrong.
Sweet. Anybody listening, if you want to do a super chat, we're donating all the super chats to Ray, and this is like kind of your last chance because I'm gonna answer or ask Kyle these. So Eli says, "Thank you, Eli, $2. Cheers, Dr. Ray Pete. Thank you, Eli." There's like a redacted one for $5. Message retracted. Thank you. It doesn't give a name. Thank you, thank you so much. And then DBO 514 for $2. Thank you so much. He says generational adaptation from PUFA depletion. So, if like the transgenerational effects, I guess, of PUFA depletion.
That's I don't know. I actually just wrote a paper on that. That was the third chapter of my dissertation, and the work was finally finished by an undergrad that was doing like a undergrad thesis. And I wrote it up, and I'm going through the review process now with the journal.
Nice.
And it was intergenerational effects of different fatty acids. And the only thing that I found in mice is that if you feed the pregnant mothers PUFA versus saturated fat, their offspring are more likely to be insulin resistant, but it didn't change obesity. So I don't know. There hasn't been anything on humans done like that. And I don't know if there's any like suggested genetic, epigenetic mechanism that would be changed from the type of fatty acids. I just don't think it's gotten to where they're asking those questions. But it just, from like a big picture perspective, it would make sense that if there are epigenetic mechanisms for having or not having a nutrient, which it seems like there are, there would be maybe some for having a different type of fatty acid, although probably a little bit less tuned, because it's more likely that there would be short-term evolutionary changes where there would be like famines and stuff like that, where these epigenetic effects would happen, rather than like a population kind of, switch from the fat from, cows to the fat from fish or something like that. But yeah, I really don't know.
Sweet, brother. Is there anything else that we didn't get to that you wanted to talk about? Also, like, mention what you're working on, where people can find you, etc. I know your website is down. Wish it was still up.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm going to go back to the website. The thing is, it takes a really long time to write things. I was thinking about doing that same thing and writing like what would be blog posts and just making them audio essays on YouTube.
Brilliant.
And then, yeah, there is a YouTube channel called Nutrichronology that has like one video of me cooking oxtail. And that'll eventually have more videos. And I don't know, maybe we'll do a stream on there sometime. I don't know, but
I'd love to. We just got two really generous super chats. So one from Steph for $31.41. Thank you, Steph. That's amazing. Thank you so much. And then Beloved says $10 and says, love this talk. So thank you guys. It warms my ice cold heart. I interrupted you, but keep going.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to try to do like a science education YouTube channel that's centered around biomedical and particularly nutrition. I just kind of haven't figured out exactly what the format's going to be, but definitely I don't want to do anything that's like anything that anybody else is doing. So, and let's see what else is going on. Just kind of finishing up like science. I think I'm probably going to step away from the whole academic game and
Chris Masterjohn.
Yeah. That's I'm probably not going to do coaching the way he does and like let me coach you with your 23andMe results or whatever he's like doing. It's like 23 is company and 24 plus Chris Masterjohn is a crowd.
I love him to death, but yeah, I think I'm curious how he goes about doing that. That wouldn't be my approach, but It's very interesting, but we're not making fun of him right now or anything. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
actually, it's like I really like him,
Yeah.
and he's probably like the smartest person that came out of the paleo sphere.
For 100%. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, probably by quite a bit.
Yeah.
It is just funny the way, like, I could just imagine he probably has to say, "This is just my opinion, not to be construed as medical advice," every sentence that he's looking at somebody's like snips, you know, uh, and giving them like dietary or lifestyle or pharmacological advice. Um, but yeah, I I am planning on writing up a a manuscriptized version of the 2017 talk about how sugar doesn't cause insulin resistance.
We didn't even get to it, but yeah, that's another great one.
Yeah, I want to try. I think that could be publishable as a short review of just this. Like, I'm not sure anybody has really laid it out, but just lay out the arguments. Like, this is why people are saying sugar causes insulin resistance, and just lay out the case, and then present questions to that case. And it might even start like a back and forth thing, but I think that would be publishable. And I do have a draft of that was rejected from the AHS journal for reasons.
I thought they were a really open-minded journal. That's surprising.
Yeah, they did like they were fine with my. I don't know what happened. I guess like that I touched a nerve with the first talk in 2016, and there's something about my personality where it's like I just had to double down, and I guess that was too much.
Well, Kyle, thank you so much. I'm again, like I said, this was like therapy because I was so distraught after my zero carb video and getting
So you just get a lot of negative comments or what?
I'm mostly joking. That
Oh,
video did exactly what it needed to do, but I guess like it was like a first take thing. So I just like put the camera on and talked for 10 minutes and did it twice and picked the better one. But if I knew that it would generate that much conversation, I would have taken my time a little bit more to, I guess, like you can't anticipate, I guess, what people are going to criticize about like the video. But a lot of people were like, we just didn't like how you presented it. So I'm like, okay, so, like, sorry for like how I went about putting the information together, I guess. But you have like a very cogent way of explaining things, especially from your AHS talks, which I really appreciate. I think it's like you do a masterful job of laying out the information and going through it systematically. So I really respect that about you. And so I was just like, I'm done with it. Like I have nothing more to offer. But then I was like, dude, you have a friend in IRL that used to do Raw Carnivore, and that was one of the big things. It was like, well, nobody can take you seriously because you did a meat and water diet, even though Sean Baker and even like Jordan Peterson stuff, those people are, I don't, Jordan's
that's
not
right.
necessarily
Yeah.
promoting that, but those people are meat and water people. And so
Mhm.
again, there's another faction on YouTube that are saying, no, it's just a high animal, mostly raw or whatever. And so I have no interest in getting into fisticuffs with people, but I do want to be as clear as possible about things. So, yeah, cool, man.
Yeah.
Guys, thank you so much for watching. Total pleasure. Thank you, Kyle, so much. Thank you guys, everybody in the chat. Thank you for everybody watching this afterwards. Again, amazing audience. Again, all thanks to Kyle. And that's it. Enjoy this wonderful music.
All right.